In your Epic Games launcher, make sure you have the Fab UE plugin installed to your engine. We're going to need this to bring in our Megascans assets. I'm going to be using version 5.4.4. For the template, just go to architecture blank and then create your project. Then create a blank level, right click, level, L_Dreamscape tutorial. You should have this. Then we'll just do edit, plugins. Make sure you have the PCG framework plugin enabled. Project settings, just type in Ray Track. I've just got all of these turned on. In terms of editor preferences, I've got arc ball rotate on, which you'll see me use later. I've also got preview selected cameras turned off, just so we have more screen real estate, and also we're going to be working in a 2-pane view anyways. Let's add our post-process volume. First thing I want to do is type in lumen, turn all these guys up. Lumen reflections, and these guys up as well. Ray lighting mode, make sure this is on hit lighting for reflections. We need high quality translucency reflections because we will be having water. And then I just like turning this up to 0.6 so that we have a bit more of a range for our ray trace reflections. All the other basic things, so type in unbound. Let's also lock our exposure. So enable these guys, 0 and 0 and then 0. For now, I'm going to turn my bloom off, and I'll also turn off my lens flare. Cool, that's your basic project setup. For our default lighting, let's just go up to Window, Environment Light Mixer, and then just click all of these buttons, and then we'll have our basic default light setup. For our viewport setup, go up to this top left menu, go down to Layout, and then select 2 panes, and that way we will have this split view setup. I'm using the cinematic viewport on the left, and then just default viewport on the right. That way we can have our camera view on the left, and then our working viewport on the right. Okay, let's quickly make our landscape. So I'm just going to maximize my right viewport, go up to landscape mode, and then hit create on the default settings. I'm going to go back to my selection mode, and then just make sure you have an object that is of human scale, and you can also just go up to here, go to shapes, cube, and this is also a 1 meter by 1 meter cube. This will just help us keep the scale in mind when sculpting our landscape. I'm going to move my mannequin to 0, 0, go up to the plus menu, cinematic, cine camera actor, rotate it. I'm going to go back to my 2-pane view, select our cine camera actor, and then just move it up so that it's in the correct spot. And then I'm also going to use the grid just to align the head, or where the eyes would be, to maybe around where the horizon is, somewhere like there. And now I'm just going to correct the rotation, just make sure it's at 90, and then 0 this out as well. All right, for our sculpting tool, I'm going to press Shift 2 to go back into landscape mode, which are these shortcuts here. So with the sculpt tool, I like to have a kind of far away terrain that's typically the taller stuff. And you don't need to worry about it being clean for now because we will smooth it out. And then I think I'm going to make my brush a bit smaller, maybe 1024. And then this is kind of where I like to have my mid-ground terrain, something like that. And then in front of that, I'll have some smaller terrain hills. So something like that. And then I'm going to go back up to my 2048, and then also just kind of have a bit of sculpting to create a circle around our camera, so that if we move our camera around, we're not gonna end up seeing nothingness. You can increase the strength if you like to something like 0.5, and then you could get something a bit more drastic. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hold Shift and then bring this whole middle area down. I'm holding Shift and just clicking, and that'll bring all of this stuff down. And then what we can do is go up to our plus menu, shapes, plane, and this will be our water plane. So I'm going to zero out the coordinates and then just scale it up. Move it into place, scale it up some more. So this will be our water. I might move our camera actor a little further back. And now what we can do is I'm going to go back into the landscape mode, Shift 2, grab our smoothing tool, and then put this on to maybe 0.3 or 0.2, and then just kind of give these all like a smooth so that it's not so noisy or lumpy. And you can see this kind of smooths out our hills, and I'm pretty much looking on this left viewport this whole time. So smooth these guys out. I'll go back to the sculpt tool. Maybe I want this right side to be higher, and maybe I want this to be a bit higher. I'm going to hold Shift to bring this down a bit more, and then I might bring these guys up in the background to sort of give a bit more layering. And then again, grab the smooth tool and just kind of lightly go over it a bit. Cool, so that's our landscape setup. All right, let's get our assets in the project. So just click this Fab button on the bottom left, and then it should open this guy up. If you search for tufted grass, I think that's how you say it, you should find this Quixel asset tufted grass, and then just click it and then add to project. The next asset we want is boxwood, and then just find these sort of bushy hedge-like plants. Just click that, and then also add that to project. Once you've imported them in, you should have this boxwood and tufted grass folder in your content browser under the Fab and Megascans parent folders. Okay, let's quickly get our water material set up. So just go to the all parent folder and then type in water. And you should have this m_water material if you set up your project like I did. And what you can do is with this selected, Control B, and that'll go to the folder that the material is in. And you can see plugins, Datasmith, materials, water. So what I'd recommend is getting one of the material instances and then just pressing Control D, and that will make a duplicate of it. And then what I've done is I'll just drag this material instance into my common materials folder and then move it there. What we can do is now drag this material instance onto our plane, and this will be our water. Now, one thing you might not have that mine does is if you go into your material instance, then go into the parent material, you want to double click this attribute water material function, and let me make that bigger. And you want to change your roughness to something lower than what the default is. I think by default it's like 0.2 or something. So I've set mine to 0.02 so that it's a lot more shiny. The next thing I'll do is probably increase the wave size to like 1,000. So that's a little bigger like this. And then maybe the wave strength can be 0.1. So a little more subtle. And then I'll also change the flow to be this 90 degrees so that it's flowing forwards, but you can choose all of that yourself. And that's pretty much it. I'll probably maybe make this a little darker and then have a slight blue tint to it, but you won't really be able to tell in this view anyway. You can also change the wind gust size and things like that. I've turned mine to 0. Okay, so I've dragged out all of the tufted grass assets that we downloaded, and what we want to do is make a little clump of them together that we will then scatter across our landscape using PCG. What I like to do is just drag it out here onto any surface, and then I'll just group them and then rotate them like this, and you'll see how I can rotate it in any direction I want. That is because we enabled the arc ball rotate at the beginning of this video. Sorry, arc ball, not bowl. Okay, so once you've made a little bunch like this, I'm just going to select all of them, right click, go to level, and then create level instance. And then my pivot type can just be the center minimum Z, which should be the middle of the clump at the lowest point on the Z axis. And then we can just hit OK. And I'm going to save it in my tutorial folder, create a new folder within that, call it PCG. And then in the PCG, I'll call it assembly grass tutorial, and then hit save. You'll notice the pivot is a bit lower than the actual grass itself, but we can correct for that in the PCG graph when we scatter them. You could also have just chosen a different option to what I did. I probably should have anyway. So now with this assembly level instance saved, we want to find it in our content browser, right click, go to asset actions, and then create PCG asset from levels, and then just hit save in the same folder, and that'll make a PCG data asset of what we've just made. So now this level instance is literally just an instance of the original thing that we made. And then you can also right click and you can edit the level like this, and then say I want this to be way out here, and then hit enter or hit exit and then yes. You'll notice that now applies to all the other instances in the scene. So I'm just going to Control Z, which I don't think I can do. So go back to level, edit. Now you know you can't Control Z it. I'm going to drag that back into my bunch, hit exit, yes, and now we're good to go. So now that we've saved this out, you can delete the instances from your scene because they are now in your content browser. All right, let's set up the PCG logic now. Okay, so in your PCG folder, right click in the content browser, find the PCG menu, and then do PCG graph. And I'm just going to call it PCG grass tutorial. Double click to open. In the graph itself, let's first get landscape data and then a surface sampler. And if I press D to debug, nothing will show up, and that is because we first want to drag, we'll save all, we first want to, also I'm getting that weird bug with Fab. Like now when I import Megascans assets, I'm getting this weird like BP foliage actor bug. Yeah, this guy, it will not save. Look, if I try to save it, it can't. Anyway, so let's just drag our PCG graph into the world itself, and it should create this box. And because we are debugging our surface sampler, you can see these are the points where it would spawn our grass. So let me just turn this off for now and just make it the size of the landscape in your camera view. Okay, something like this should work. Now if we go back to our PCG graph, debug the surface sampler, this is where it's spawning all of our objects. Now the first thing I'm going to do is reduce the point extents to 10, 10, 10, so that we can fit more points in our landscape. And then I'm going to increase the points per square meter to 2. I might leave it on actually 1 for now, just in case it gets a bit laggy. So the rest of the setup is very simple. We're just going to drag out our transform points, and I'm going to do Control-Alt-D to just isolate this transform to debug. And what I'm going to do is set the min rotation or max rotation to 360, so it's randomized a bit, and then also the max rotation to something like 2 and 2 in the X and Y. I'm also going to do the min-max scale to 2 and 2.5, so that way the grass will look a lot more lush, because if we have it really small, unfortunately, because of Unreal Engine and like opacity maps and how the way these assets work, it won't look super lush, or we'll need to clone a bunch of points to get it to look lush, and then our scene will get way too laggy. So now that we've randomized our points, we can grab our assembly PCG data asset, drag it into the graph, and then we want to find a copy points. And then what we want to do is drag the assembly points into the source and then the transform points into the target. So if I Control D this, these are all the points from our PCG data asset being copied to our sampled points. So press D to stop debugging. Now the last thing we want to do is spawn our actual static meshes. So to do that, grab a static mesh spawner. By the way, I learned all of this from a lot of Chris Murphy's really great Unreal Engine talks. He has great PCG info and just things that are a little more intermediate skill-wise in terms of tips and tricks. I also sent out the videos that I watched in my recent newsletter, so subscribe to that if you are keen on receiving that sort of info. Just anything creative related is what I send out weekly. I don't spam you at all, by the way. Now, if we plug this copy point into the static mesh spawner, nothing is going to happen, because usually you would add a mesh entry and that's how it would spawn it, but we want it to spawn from our level instance that we made earlier. So if I just select our PCG data asset and press A and then drag this window up, we're going to just, and by the way, what A does is we can inspect the node and we can see the data within it. What we want to find is what is the name of the category where our static meshes are. And if I just scroll a bit, it should be mesh. So this mesh column is where it is linking or sourcing the meshes that we used for from our content browser. I did not explain that the best, but this is the meshes that we've used for our level instance is what I mean. And we just want to make sure we take note of this column name, because what we want to do is in our static mesh spawner, we want to change from mesh selected weighted to by, I want to say attribute. And then if I just type in mesh, give it a sec, it might lag a bit. There we go. We now have grass spawning across our entire landscape. And then I feel like the scale might be a little too big here, so I might reduce my min-max scale to 1.5 and 2. And I just realized, I need to take my creatine. I just realized we need to move our grass down to the actual landscape. So what I'm going to do is go to my transform points. I'm going to just press E on our static mesh spawner so that it stops spawning in our static meshes. Go to our transform point and then change our offset minimum and maximum to something like -20. Okay, so -40 seems to be the way to go. And then what I can do is go back to my surface sampler and then up this to 2. So I'm doubling it, which is a lot. Just keep in mind, you want to be quite careful with this points per square meter, so don't increase it by heaps at a time. Just do little increments if you can. And now we've got a pretty full, lush looking grass landscape. Now, one neat trick I like doing is if you go to your static mesh spawner and then go to template descriptor, this is where you can control the mesh settings of these meshes in your level instance. So I'm just going to go back to that. And what I like to do is turn off cast dynamic shadow and cast static shadow. It might take a little while for it to kick in, so just keep that in mind. Now it might look a bit worse because there's no actual shadows in here, but what that means is if we go to our directional light and I just type in contact and then enable world space units for the contact shadow, and if I make it something like 50, we now get some contact shadows here. I've also got a higher frame rate, and I just feel like I get better control over how much shadow I want in the scene. So if I go back to this view, go to my directional light, maybe if I make it 20, it's a less shadow or more contrast, 100, a lot more contrast. So this is a cool way to control the amount of shadow that your foliage is showing. And I found this out through one of the really useful assets on the marketplace. This guy who made nanite foliage grass asset, which I'll make a tutorial on soon. This was one of the tips in his videos for the setup. You kind of have to use this method for his grass. So I just ended up using on some Quixel grass and it worked super well. And now if I go to our sun and then rotate it around a bit, you can see we are getting some like nice specular highlights. We can lower the sun a bit, increase our source angle to something like 20, get some soft shadows in there, rotate it around a bit more. Another thing I'm going to turn off is the volumetric clouds because I just don't think they look that good, the built-in ones at least. If you do have ultra dynamic sky, those look really good in these types of scenes, so definitely check that out. So one thing we still need to do, which can also help reduce the amount of grass meshes we are spawning, is we need to add a surface material to our landscape. We need a landscape material. So if you go to Fab and you type in grass, any of the Quixel grass assets are good. It's a little tricky now because if I type in grass and then I just limit it to materials and textures, there's a bunch of materials called grass and I'm not entirely sure which one mine is because they've kind of gotten rid of these codes, which is annoying. So I'm pretty sure it's the first one or the third one. It's one of those two, but what you can do is just download it and then drag it onto your landscape like this. And then if I turn my grass back on, you can see it sort of fills up the darker areas with that material. I could even reduce my surface sampler points to 1.5 and you can see it reduced a bunch and you can't really tell too much. Maybe here near the ground or near the water you can kind of tell, but you definitely can reduce a lot just by having a material with the same color underneath it. And in my example at the beginning, in terms of having like pink grass and stuff like that, if you just go to the material of the grass itself, and then I recommend making a copy. I was just wondering why it's not working, and it's because I'm editing the duplicate. So what you want to do is you make a duplicate as a backup and then edit the original so that you don't need to reapply it to your assets. So what I'll do is turn off tint leaf backside, enable base color tint, and this is where you can sort of make it whatever color you want. Something like that could work. And then I would maybe desaturate it a bit. You'll now want to adjust the surface or the landscape material as well. So this is where you could probably just do a color picker and do something like that, and then maybe brighten it a bit. And now you've got a landscape. And if I make a copy of this camera actor and then pilot it, you can now sort of get different angles like this. You could increase your PCG graph box. Actually, let me do that right now. Let's just see what happens. Honestly, not the worst thing in the world. It is a bit laggy and I am recording, but it works pretty nicely. Anyway, now let's move on to scattering the boxwood plants that we also downloaded. Okay, so now we got to set up our bush shrubs that I had kind of scattered around in clumps. So what we want to do is open up your PCG graph for the grass and then just press E on your static mesh spawner, so we'll disable it. That way we'll have quicker updates when showing this or testing this out. Okay, so once that's disabled, we want to drag out of our landscape data and then get another surface sampler. I'm just going to press D to debug it. And I'm going to change the point extents to 10, 10, 10. And then I'm going to change the points per square meter up to 2 again. But we're going to filter these out. So first, I'm going to filter these out with an attribute filter. And what I want to do is make sure this does not go below our waterline, and also maybe a little above as well, so we can filter points by height. And to do that, what we want to do is get the attribute filter and change from less than or equal to, I believe. And then for the target attribute, just do the plus icon and then go to position. And then at the end of position, just add a dot and then Z. And then what you can do is just get a transform points just to visualize it. Because if we visualize just this node, nothing happens. And sorry, another thing we need to do also is uncheck the use spatial query and then use constant threshold, and then change this from double to float. And what this means is if I change this, from greater than or equal to, now you'll see anything above this number will, anything below this number will be culled out of the point selection. And now I want to clump these up. So I'm going to delete the transform points and then I want to get a spatial noise. And then I'm going to Control-Alt-D the spatial noise. And I'm just going to up the contrast to something like 10. And what you can see is there's a bit of a noise map happening. And if I just increase the scale to 20, now you'll see we've got a noise map across all of our sampled points. And what I want to do is kind of stretch these out. So I'm just going to reduce the X value to something like maybe 5, and then maybe even less than that, maybe 2, to have them thinner. And then this could go up to like a 40. I reckon something like that could work. And then what I'll do from then is maybe reduce my contrast a bit, because we will now be filtering these out with a density filter. And what that does is it culls out points that are included within these two values. So you'll see as I move this down, it kind of culls out the darker points or the lighter points, which is why you kind of want to play with this contrast amount and then see how many points you want. I think I want to lower the contrast to something like just 1 could work. And then out of our density filter, I want these points to sort of scale down as they reach the edges of this. So what we can do with that is get a execute blueprint and then Control-Alt-D to debug that, and then just type in scale, and you should find a scale by density. And then I'm just going to set the scale max to 1. That should be scaling out these gray points, which I'm culling out so it won't matter. So maybe to fix that, I can get a remap. Yeah, okay. So now you can see if I remap it, I can bring in some of those values again, or remap this density filtered range. So I can remap that, disconnect the scale by density, and then bring this guy in. Yeah, there we go. And now you can see it's a bit subtle, but as it gets to the edge or to darker values, darker values get smaller and whiter values get larger. So that's pretty much what we want. Okay, then last thing we want to do is just randomize these a bit. So transform points, debug this guy, make the max rotation 360, and then also maybe make the rotation min -2, -2, and then +2 in the X and Y. And then I might also make the scale min 3.5 and 4. So it should look pretty good. And now we just want to get a static mesh spawner and stop debugging. Now let's find our boxwood. And I'm pretty sure I was using this guy here. And you can see I've already adjusted the color the exact same way I did with the grass that I showed you earlier. And then just go to your static mesh spawner, mesh entries, drop down all the menus, and then just drag it into that. And there you go. And now we've got all the bushes. So it looks a little weird right now. So what I'm gonna do is maybe first bring it down a bit, maybe -10 and -10, so that it's sinking in a bit more. And then what I want to do is just see how it looks with the grass. Yeah, and I think I want to actually move these up a bit more. So maybe 10 and then 10. I might reduce my grass samples so that this updates a lot quicker. I might try like 0.5. And I'm also going to do the same settings for the boxwood, and that is to disable the dynamic and static shadow. I don't want the noise pattern to be as stretched. So what I'm going to do is go back to my spatial noise in the transform and then maybe make this something like 10. And that should clump them up a bit more. Something like that. Exactly. I might reduce the size a bit. Maybe 3 in the min, a 3.5 in the max, or 3.25. And now that I'm happy with the clumping of my boxwood, I'm going to go back to my surface sampler and then up the count back up to my points per square meter. And then what you can do is then up the brightness of the grass material, maybe something like that. Change the saturation a bit, change your landscape material, go back to the boxwood material, maybe desaturate this guy a bit. And that's pretty much the basics of like this dreamscape. You probably want to fiddle with the colors a little more. And then what I like to do is once I'm happy with the general look and feel is go into my post-process volume. And then I have a few LUTs in my assets folder. And I'll just try out a few different LUTs, like LUT 03 is quite nice. I have a few Kodak LUTs and just like find a look that kind of suits the colors I'm after. And then you can add some bloom to soften things a bit more. So I'll go into my bloom, something like that, and then up the threshold a bit, and then go back to my LUT. So maybe find something with a bit more contrast, and then change the sun angle a bit, do something like that, lower the intensity a little more, go a little higher, maybe turn the bloom down a tad. Now I'll just show you some of my other lighting scenarios. To get this sort of contrasty lighting as well as the realistic sky, I've just used a HDRI backdrop. For the HDRI backdrop, you can just go to the plus menu, lights, HDRI backdrop. That should be enabled if you use the architecture blank template. If it's not, just go to your plugins, type in HDRI, and there it is right there. And if I just show you my settings, I've made it massive, 40,000 in the size for the radius, and then also up to the projection center to 20,000. And then this is just a sky from the Grayscale Gorilla Pack, but you can also get stuff from Polyhaven. They have great realistic skies as well, because I just feel like the subtleness and the wispiness of these clouds just look a lot more realistic. And as for the actual spotlights here, I've just placed a bunch of spotlights and they all have the same contact shadow length setting. And that way I can sort of art direct where I want my lights to be, and it kind of gives this nice contrast between the background and the foreground and has this sort of abstract surrealist feeling to it, while also giving nice contrast and shape to the landscape. So you can see here I've kind of done that in this view and in this view. Unfortunately, I've overwritten my grass materials from the tutorial project, so I've kind of lost the colors from my original render, but that's kind of just how it works. Anyways, I probably need to adjust these a bit. Thank you for watching. See you guys in the next one. Peace. Hopefully I can fix up these colors. Otherwise, honestly, I might just leave the OG renders and move on to the next thing.